Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to be looking at the uniques in Path of Exile, what makes some of them extremely good, and what makes most of them complete garbage. So if you're like me, at one point in this game, maybe when you first started, or if you're watching this video, maybe you do this right now, you have a tab in your stash that looks like this, where you hoard all of your uniques. And the reason you're doing this is because in other games, you've been taught that uniques are rare and powerful and worth holding on to. It's not typically the case in Path of Exile. Path of Exile, like other ARPGs, is in some ways a loot fiesta, which means everybody is finding more loot than they could ever actually need to use. And so if you consider a particular build, like for instance my build here, if you look at the items I'm using, I do actually use quite a few uniques. Between my items and my flasks, I'm using 11 different uniques. But even with a build like that, which is pretty unique heavy actually, um, 11 uniques probably drop in an hour or two of playing this game. So what that means is that more uniques are going to drop than the market could ever sustain. There really isn't a huge demand out there for Solaris Loricas or Soul Mantles or Cragheads. And so 99% of the time when a unique drops, it's just going to be vendor trash. So what does this mean for a new player? Are you supposed to pick up all the uniques you find? Are you supposed to try to price them and sell them? To start off with, there's really no way around it. You kind of just have to get acquainted with some of these uniques and figure out which ones are good. And even veteran players sometimes struggle with this because the game is constantly changing league to league. For instance, the Baron, this helm right here, was worth probably at least 20 or 30 chaos, if not more, a couple leagues ago when minion builds got buffed. But now, if we price check it, we'll see that probably worth it's worth about a chaos, right? Whereas something like Taproot I don't think has ever been good. I could be wrong, but I can pretty safely say this is not going to be worth anything. Yeah. And so the reason that I know this is because I have probably picked up 100, 200 taproots and vendored them. And I've also picked up a handful of barons and been able to sell a couple of them. So there's no real way around this process of just getting familiarized with all the different uniques. And you'll start to realize that maybe 80, 90% of the ones you pick up are just trash and they get vendored. And that's just part of the process. But you aren't alone in this. If you have a good loot filter, it is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of telling you which items are worth picking up and price checking. So for instance, if we drop a couple items on the ground, you can see that different uniques will make different sounds when they drop. And generally speaking, the more noise it makes and the shinier the nameplate is, the more likely it is to be good. It isn't always the case though, because loot filters can't determine the difference between different uniques that drop on the same base type. So for instance, if we look at this leather belt again, it's always going to make a, a kind of a noisy sound when it drops, because Headhunter, one of the most expensive items in the game, is a leather belt. And the loot filter can never be sure whether the leather belt that's dropped is a headhunter or not, but 99.9% of the time, when a leather belt drops, it's not a headhunter and it's probably garbage. So same thing here for this perfidy. Even though it has the nameplate of an exalted orb, it's only worth 1 chaos. So, I mean, I would still pick it up and price check it and then be disappointed. But that's because there's only one other glorious plate unique in the game, and that's Comb's Heart, and that's usually worth a nice little chunk of change if it does drop for you. So you do want to be careful. You can't trust your loot filter too much, because if we look at two different sulfur flasks, Bottled Faith and the Overflowing Chalice, they both make the same sound when they drop because of course the loot filter can't tell the difference. However, if we go and price check these two flasks, so we can go to PoE Ninja. If you're not familiar with this, it's just a place to sort of look up price trends for a lot of items as well as other things. And we look at the flasks. We can see that Bottled Faith is up there at the top going for 14 exalts, whereas down at the bottom there's Overflowing Chalice going for less than 1 chaos. So if an item drops and it makes some noise, you probably want to double check its price, just to be sure. Now, after a while, again, you'll get in the habit of seeing overflowing chalice and think, well, this is just trash, I'll just vendor it. But until you get to that point, you don't want to leave behind something that's worth a ton of cash. I think a lot of people have this fear that leads them to hoard their uniques or pick them all up and try to sell them, and it's that they are worried they're leaving behind an item worth an insane amount of currency on the ground. And really, that's almost never the case. If we look at PoE Ninja's breakdown of just looking at the unique weapons, we can see there's only 5 that go for more than an Exalt. And of those, the Savior and Starforge are only drops off of particular bosses, and Paradoxica, I think, is also just a drop off of Betrayal safe houses. And so, the most expensive weapon you could leave behind would be Cosprey's Malice right now, which is worth 2x. You don't want to do that. But if you do make a mistake, chances are, what are you losing out on? At most, maybe you're missing out on 10, 20 chaos. And that's really not the end of the world. And really, you have to consider, is your time playing the game more enjoyable if you aren't always worried that you're losing out on some currency because of all these uniques that are dropping? Okay, let's say you do pick up some items, they made some nice sounds in the loot filter, and you think, I should double check to see if this thing is worth anything. How can I go about that? So, for instance, let's look at this Queen of the Forest. And the easiest thing to do is to just do a simple search of Queen of the Forests. And you could do this on the trade website, or you could do it with the macro. And we'll see, okay, so the cheapest Queen of the Forests out there are going for 1 chaos. Now, if you mouse over any particular unique, you're going to see that there are a ton of different mods on it. They can have way more mods than rare items, and the mods themselves can be pretty strange and unique. And if you notice, 6 of the 8 mods here have a range on them, which means that every Queen of the Forest is going to roll with those mods between those endpoints. And so if we look at, say, the evasion and the life roll, which to me seem like the most important here, we can see that ours are pretty bad, kind of mediocre. So I would guess that our Queen of the Forest is probably worth 1 chaos, but let's say it rolled with perfect life and perfect evasion. So we can actually double check that here. We can say, alright, if our Queen of the Forest had the top roll of evasion and the top roll of life, how much would it be worth? And you can see it's worth 80, 100, maybe even an Exalt. So it can be important to just mouse over the uniques when you go to sell them and make sure that if you're going to price it just at the lowest price, that you have a mediocre or maybe bad unique. But if you notice that your rolls happen to be really high, really close to the top end, do an advanced search and try to make sure that you're pricing yours according to the value that it has. A little nuance to uniques that doesn't come up as often with other types of items. Because the mods are fixed, it doesn't matter what item level a unique has, it'll always have the same mods. So for instance, if this Queen of the Forest, for some reason, happened to drop out of a zone, or was turned in with divination cards, or came out of some weird event, and the result was that it was item level 1 or 2, it would still have this same sort of stat breakdown, but there would be something very bad about it. And if we go to the wiki, we can see that under item sockets, the number of sockets that can roll on a particular item is based on its item level. And so in order to have 6 sockets on an item, which is what you usually want on a chess piece, the item has to be at least level 50. So even though an eye level 1 Queen of the Forest would have a stat breakdown that looks basically the same as this, it would be unable to roll a high number of sockets no matter how many jewelers you put into it. So just be careful when buying, selling, or trying to craft on a unique that it has the item level you need to have the sockets that you want. So you might be thinking, well then what's the point if all the uniques usually end up being trash? And I would say that you shouldn't feel bad picking up uniques because even if you vendor them, they are worth a decent amount of currency. The vendors will give you usually about half an alc, if not more, for a lot of these items. And so don't feel bad that you're vendoring away uniques. I know that initially that can feel bad, but I actually feel pretty good when I pick up a bunch of uniques and vendor them because I know I'm getting some meaningful currency out of it. One thing to know about unique rings, though, is that they are almost always worth picking up. So there are some rings that on their own are worth currency for the same reason any unique is worth currency. But even the trash unique rings are worth picking up because if you're able to sell 60 rings all at once, so an entire inventory full of rings, the vendor will give you a lore weave, which just happens to be the chess piece I'm using right now. And so what that does is it sort of sets the floor on what a unique ring is worth. So even the trash unique rings are worth 1 chaos, and it's probably worth picking them up to save up for a lore weave or just to sell to other players who are going for one. There is one last thing we have to talk about, and it's the worst item in this game, and it's called Bitter Dream. So this particular unique drops, and you pick it up thinking that you're going to sell it to a vendor, and that vendor is going to give you some alch shards, and that's going to be nice. But what actually happens is when you sell the Bitter Dream, the vendor will give you back a bunch of level 1 gems, which is the worst because then, when you do this on accident, your inventory is now full of these level 1 gems, and you either need to delete them or you have to sell them back for scraps. And in either case, you're wasting all this time and it feels really bad. So you really don't want to pick up Bitter Dreams, or if you do, you want to keep them in your inventory until you play with your friends and then drop them in their maps so that they are forced to accidentally pick them up and have to deal with them themselves.